Even before the French Revolution began and Napoleon wrought havoc in Europe, a new, different revolution, an industrial revolution, had begun in Great Britain. In order to understand this revolution and its spread, we must first understand the manufacturing world before industrialization. But then we're going to see how industrialization really did create a changing world. Humans have been manufacturing or making goods by hand since prehistory. In fact, our word manufacture comes from the Latin manu, for manus, hands, and factur, from, in fact, to make. For most of human prehistory and history, though, humans either made their own goods or purchased or traded for them with craftspeople and artisans. This meant that goods were generally expensive, especially if they'd been made by an expert, by a craftsman. Well, during the Renaissance, the economy had increasingly become money-based, and as the size of cities grew, there were more artisans, so the price of goods became marginally cheaper. All of that was great stuff. Now, during the Age of Exploration, as the Spaniards discovered enormous silver mines in the Americas, Europe's economy experienced a glut of silver, which caused a price revolution in Europe. Well, basically, as more silver and gold flowed into Europe, the value of these metals dropped. This is what's known as the law of scarcity. The more scarce something is, the more valuable it is. So, in contrast, the more present something is, the less valuable it is. The influx of precious metals caused inflation. That's what happens when the value of money decreases. The prices of things go up. This price revolution did hurt the standard of living in Europe, especially among the peasantry, although this was partly offset by agricultural changes. And in fact, you see that on the graph here. Look at how farm wages was far below the prices of goods during this time. The agricultural changes of the 16th through 18th centuries mostly aided in increasing the standard of living across Europe. As we've already learned, in the 16th century, the Columbian Exchange introduced new crops to Europe, especially corn and the potato. The potato in particular was easy to grow in Europe, and it became a staple crop in both the German states and in Ireland. The potato is high in calories or carbohydrates, but it's cheap to grow, which made it an ideal food for peasants who couldn't afford any better, but with the potato could still get the caloric intake that they needed. In the 17th century, English landowners further adopted the use of the four-field rotation, which allowed landowners to produce crops year-round without leaving any part fallow. They could grow crops for livestock and crops for human consumption at the same time, which led to greater food production, which led, inevitably, to larger populations. In the image here, you see what that four-field rotation was: barley, clover, turnips, and wheat. Generally speaking, the wheat and the barley was for human consumption, the clover and the turnips was for livestock. However, there was one agricultural change which did not increase the standard of living, especially for the peasants, and this was the process of enclosure. In the 18th century, in an effort to take advantage of their land reserves, European nobility, or landowners, began enclosing their land, literally putting fences up around their land. This movement stopped peasants from using land that had formerly been considered common land, where they could grow their stuff as well. This made peasants poorer and nobles richer. To make matters worse for the peasantry, landowners insisted on monetary rents. You had to pay your rent in money, no longer in production. And as a result of this, you had fewer tenant farmers who were really able to provide for themselves and their families, but landowners got richer and richer. So it's important to note that the Industrial Revolution didn't just pop up out of nowhere, and in fact you had the rudiments of industrialization as far back as the Renaissance. Cottage industries really were pioneered during the Renaissance. What happened was that merchants would act as coordinators between buyers and sellers, and they used skilled rural workers who always needed a little bit of extra money for manufacturing, especially textile manufacturing. And the process was very simple. What you see in the image is the process of this production. A merchant would buy large amounts of raw materials, usually cotton or wool, and then would hand over the raw materials to rural carders and or spinners. There's a spinner depicted right here. And these people would change that cotton or wool into yarn or thread. The merchant would then pick up that yarn or thread and in turn hand it over to somebody who would weave the cloth, and then sometimes even to a third party, a dyer, who would bleach the cloth or dye the cloth a specific color. The merchant would then come back, retrieve the finished cloth, and then would sell it in the cities usually at a hefty profit. Now, it's possible that Europe could have transitioned into an industrial economy earlier than they did, but that earlier transition really was restricted by the supremacy of mercantilism as an economic policy. And we've studied mercantilism before. It's the belief that the nation should maintain and increase its wealth by exporting more than they're importing. And that's all well and good, but the governments heavily regulated trade as a result of mercantilism, and this included the guilds. So the guilds restricted how much of a product could be made, how much it could be sold for, and this really limited the amount of products that could be created, made, as a whole. And as a result of that, you didn't really need the ability to be able to produce large amounts of any sort of good. Now, industrialization arose in England about the middle of the 18th century, so the middle of the 1700s. Industrialization as a term simply means the change from human-made products, manufacture, to machine-made products. This is often called mechanization. As a process, industrialization began with innovations to the steam engine, which was originally invented in the 17th century in Europe. The new steam engine, which was made by an Englishman, had the potential to create great force, which in turn allowed steam engines to move large machines, or water pumps, machines that an individual human really couldn't move on their own. Now, the textile industry adopts the steam engine, and along with various other machines, they mechanized the entire fabric-making process, from spinning to weaving the cloth. And it was they who established the first factory systems. So in England, the factory arose from the basics of cottage industry. As new machines for spinning or for weaving were invented, entrepreneurs purchased several of these machines, they housed them all in one building, and then they hired workers to come to the building instead of sending raw materials out to be worked in the home. If we look at the image here on the slide, you can see some of the various jobs in a factory. You see, of course, the textile workers who aren't really weaving the cloth anymore, they're just making sure that all of the yarn is going in the right direction. This small person you see right here may have been a carder or a piecer. If they were a piecer, they were probably a child. And children's jobs were to get in between the machines and to tie back together pieces of yarn that had split because of the force of the machine. And here you have someone who's conducting just regular maintenance on the machine as well. What's really noticeable about this image is how few people, relatively speaking, you need in a factory. So what were the effects of mechanization in the textile industry? Well, there were some good ones, and really important one was that there was now a standard quality of textiles, because you didn't have the guilds anymore really to determine what those various qualities could be. In addition, so much cloth was being produced that the price of cloth in general became cheaper, and this meant that more and more people could afford to purchase machine-made cloth. But there were also significant drawbacks to mechanization. And perhaps the most important of these, at least initially, was the division of labor. What is meant by the division of labor in this context is that workers were trained in running machines, not in making cloth. So textile workers were no longer skilled workers. Somebody who had no idea how cloth was made could still work in a textile factory because all they had to know how to do was run the machine that they were working on. The same ultimately was true of all mechanized production. So the gap in workers' skill between knowing how to make something and just running a machine got quite large. As more people engaged in factory work, moreover, factory owners began building row houses, essentially tenements, to house their workers. And the reason was simple. The closer a worker is to work, the faster they can get there, the longer they can work. By the 1830s, factory owners controlled all aspects of workers' jobs, their hours, their wages, and their working conditions. And if you look at the image here at the top, you see a typical factory in a major city in England. You can see the factory in the middle, and all the way around it, homes for the workers. Now, what we also see happening is a shift of rural to urban, where workers who can no longer get jobs in the countryside have to move to the cities to work in these factories. Here's an example. In 1815, there were 250,000 weavers working. These were artisans who could create an entire suit of clothes, from spinning the raw material into yarn or thread to creating that piece of cloth. By 1850, there were only 40,000 weavers at work. And just 10 years later, in 1860, there were only 3,000 in England. That's a huge reduction in the number of skilled workers. As you can imagine, there was a reaction against the industrialization of the textile industry. In England, this was led by a legendary man called Ned Ludd. And his followers, the Luddites, attacked factories. They attempted to destroy the machines that had taken away their artisan jobs. In the image down below, you can see Luddites attacking one of these machines. They were called Luddites in England, but in other countries, of course, they received names commensurate with those cultures. And in fact, in France, the people who were protesting mechanization often banged on the machines with their shoes, which are wooden clogs. We call them sabots, and that's in fact where the word sabotage comes from. There were two waves of industrialization around the world. The first one, from the middle of the 18th century to about 1850, focused on improvements in civil engineering. The second wave, from about 1850 to about 1920, focused on the production of better materials for building, especially steel, and will have a renewed focus on transportation and communication. This is especially true after the invention of the combustible engine. This new focus on industrialization, at least in Britain, was at first hampered by the government's use of mercantilism, in which the government was heavily involved in the nation's economy. But by the end of the 18th century, a competing economic theory, that of capitalism, championed the idea that private individuals should invest in the economy and the factory system, and that the government should keep out of economic decisions. As the British government slowly adopted capitalism, the British entrepreneurs began to invest in all aspects of the production system. Not only did they build factories, but they needed ways to get their goods to market. As a result, these entrepreneurs built canals and railroads, and they used steam-powered ships and steam-powered rail cars to get their goods to market. This investment in transportation infrastructure, begun by private investors but later taken on by the British government, connected the country as it never had been before, and it facilitated the movement of both goods and people across the kingdom. So at this point in time, you're probably wondering, why the huge focus on Britain? Well, there were a variety of reasons why Great Britain was poised to take first advantage of industrialization. First of all, Britain had good environmental factors that predisposed them to innovate. Geographically, Britain was removed from the continent, and that meant that they weren't really dealing with the warfare that continental Europeans did, warfare that was brought on by petty rivalries, by the French Revolution, and later by the Napoleonic Wars, just didn't affect Britain as much as it did countries on the continent. In addition, Britain has a fairly damp climate that makes it a good place for textile production, and also had a number of natural resources, particularly of coal and iron, which were also beneficial to the whole industrialization process. Political and economic factors were also important. Britain was controlled by a stable government that had implemented capitalistic economic policies. These reduced trade barriers and allowed for the easy circulation of goods and ideas. In addition, thanks to investment in transportation infrastructure, people were able to circulate goods easily and to relocate easily, moving from the countryside to urban areas where most of the factories were located. And finally, Great Britain had multiple colonies that could supply other and sometimes better natural resources like cotton, which were then used for manufacture in the British factories and were then sold back to the colonies as completely finished goods. Social factors also influenced Britain's heads-up on the Industrial Revolution. British society was less rigid than that of the continent, meaning that people could move around the different social levels more easily. This was thanks in part to the role of Parliament in government and the fact that people had some level of representation in their government. While there were still traditional class groupings, royalty, nobility, peasantry, etc., the focus on monetary wealth made it easy to overlook these traditional hierarchies in favor of occupational groupings. So middle-class people might have enormous wealth, might thus get some political power, and thus be able to affect change within the government. Of course, the Industrial Revolution would eventually spread to the continent, but the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars would prove a hindrance. So by the time industrialization really got started on the continent, Britain was already multiple decades ahead of everyone else. Now, in 1819, so just a few years after Napoleon's defeat, the German states created one common customs union, which they call the Zollverein. This union eased the movement of goods across Central Europe, but Germany wasn't unified as a state until 1871, so full-scale industrialization wasn't really accomplished until that time, despite the fact, as you can see on the chart here, the German states actually have quite a bit of natural resources. In 1830, 15 years after Napoleon's final defeat, the French began their industrialization process. In Southern and Eastern Europe, industrialization came much later. Southern Europe would start to industrialize about the 1860s, and in Russia, industrialization really didn't even begin until the 1870s. And you can see that reflected in this map of population. Places that had bigger cities tended to be the places that industrialized most quickly. So England, of course, has their early industrialization. You can see that France is going to industrialize pretty easily. The German Confederation is going to industrialize. But look at all of Southern Europe. Look at all of the Russian Empire and Eastern Europe. These are going to be places where it's going to take much longer for them to industrialize. In Europe, and especially on the continent, after Napoleon's defeat, you have a backlash to the Enlightenment and the rise of conservative values. And what this meant was that the nobility of Europe tried very hard to maintain their position at the very top of the social ladder. And in general, this often meant that they tried to hinder the spread of industrialization because they viewed industrialization as something that the middle class does, not something that the upper class does. In addition to that, though, you had enormous political instability across Europe, especially in the south and in the east. For example, in Italy in the 1820s, you had the beginnings of a unification movement that ultimately came to nothing then. In Russia in 1825, there was a rebellion against the Tsar. In Greece in 1829, you had their final push for independence from the Ottoman Empire. And Spain, of course, between the 18-teens and the 1820s, is going to lose each and every one of its American colonial holdings. So all of this disruption is going to hinder the spread of industrialization in these areas. France, too, like the rest of continental Europe, experienced this conservative backlash. But despite outward appearances, France hadn't been politically stable since 1815. In 1824, a coup had placed the Comte d'Artois on the throne. He took the name Charles X, and he worked to cater to the needs of the people, mainly traditional nobles, who had given him the power of the throne. His actions were viewed as absolutist and way too conservative by many in the bourgeoisie. He found himself against strong nationalist opposition, and he was forced to flee France in 1830. Upon Charles X's abdication, the wealthy bourgeoisie took the opportunity to put their own candidate on the throne. They supported the Duc d'Orléans, who became King Louis Philippe in 1830. Louis was no different in catering to those who'd placed him in power, so he really was just repeating what Charles X had done. But unfortunately for the bourgeoisie, Louis Philippe began catering, slowly, more and more to the traditional nobility. And once again, the bourgeoisie were seeing themselves locked out of important political decisions. But to make matters worse, the members of the traditional third estate, the peasants and the urban poor, were slowly coming to the realization that things hadn't gotten better for them since 1789, and they were finally tired of it, tired enough, maybe, to spark their own secondary revolution. As it turns out, 1848 would go down in history as the year of revolution in Europe. In 1848, the situation was very much like pre-revolutionary France, but it was spread Europe-wide. There was a scarcity of food. In particular, the ruination of the potato crop, especially in the German states and in Ireland, led to food riots. And in addition to that, there was a widespread economic depression. In France, in February, you had a disconnect between the bourgeoisie and the king, but you also had a disconnect between the bourgeoisie and the working class. In fact, working class leaders mockingly said, "Get rich, then you can vote." Now, the city of Paris, as well as other major cities in France, had rebellions in February, but the Parisian uprisings did not go well. The working class attempted to barricade their neighborhoods from the National Guard, but the king's soldiers, increasingly feeling under fire, fired on the mob. They killed 52 people. Louis Philippe, facing a backlash now from the people of Paris, fled Paris, and France was once again leaderless. In Prussia, in March of 1848, there were uprisings by the working classes which occurred in all of the major cities of Prussia. The liberals wanted constitutions and they wanted a parliamentary government, not to mention freedom, especially from police intimidation. The craftspeople were upset. They claimed that they'd lost their jobs to machines and that they'd had to take factory jobs, which meant pay cuts and a lower standard of living. The craftspeople supported the liberal bourgeoisie, who were advocating for constitutionalism, and the princes of Prussia were forced to make concessions, like starting national assemblies, etc. But by the time we get to the 1860s, these liberals were defeated by professional soldiers, and the traditional conservative status quo would reign again. Italy also had a March Revolution. In 1848, the Italians rose up against Habsburg Austria. Their agenda was supported by many leaders, including the Pope. The Neapolitans were granted a constitution from King Ferdinand II. They were the ones who occupied the boot of Europe. And Milan and Venice gained independence from Austria, but in 1849, all of the other rebellions had been crushed by Austria. The rebellions that Italy began in March inspired other ethnic groups within the Austrian Empire to revolt as well. Austria was home to Germans, Czechs, Magyars, who are Hungarians, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, an enormous melting pot. But in Austria, people of ethnic German background reigned supreme over everyone else. These ethnic groups had finally had enough. They revolted. Hungary declared its independence. The problem, of course, is that Hungary included ethnicities that weren't Hungarian. And when the Hungarians declared independence, but then were acting like the Austrians with the other ethnic groups, these varied ethnic groups, the Croats, the Serbs, the Romanians, they all supported the Austrians. So Austria was able to neutralize Hungary's bid for independence and then settle all of the other ethnic fights that were happening. Over 100 rebels were executed, many more were exiled, and Austria kind of breathed a sigh of relief. They didn't have to deal with any more tensions in 1848. In the summer of 1848, France would experience the second of its revolutions that year, and much of it centered around the actions of one man. The socialist Louis Blanc had been instrumental in ending the February Revolution, and he began pushing for greater socialist reform in France. His platform called for expanded freedoms for everybody, and this included the redistribution of income. In order to alleviate the plight of the working poor, he pushed for the formation of nationally owned factories, which were supposed to have fabulous working conditions. They were all going to be able to work minimum hours, that was 10. They were going to be able to earn a living wage, and that was all great on paper. The problem was, as the working poor heard about this fantastic new opportunity, they left their old jobs and applied for jobs in the national factories. Soon, so many people were applying for jobs in the national factories that Louis Blanc had to walk back his promises. And instead of only working 10 hours, they were now working 12 or even 14. Instead of being paid a living wage, the wages were going down in an effort to try to employ everyone who came to the national factories. As you can imagine, this resulted in poor working conditions and in greater dissatisfaction on the part of the working poor. In June, the working class of urban areas, and in Paris particularly, revolted against these essentially unchanged working conditions. In the end, this revolution pitted the urban working poor against the rest of the country, and the rest of the country wasn't going to stand for it. The working poor were defeated by the government's professional soldiers, but the split left deep scars in French society as the working class felt that they'd been betrayed by their fellow citizens. And in fact, this was a long-standing betrayal. They weren't only betrayed in 1848. They feel like they'd been betrayed in 1830. They'd been betrayed in 1815. They'd been betrayed in 1789. And that hadn't gone away. In fact, that whole idea of betrayal is enshrined in French culture. This is especially seen in Victor Hugo's great work, Les Miserables, which picks up the story of the working poor in 1815, and it runs all the way to 1832. So this wasn't a new fight in 1848, but it was the result of really deep-seated resentments. The revolutions of 1848 were all about class divisions, often due to the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. The amazing part of it was that two men had seemed to predict all of these troubles in a work they published in January 1848, which was called The Manifesto of the Communist Party, or the Communist Manifesto. That's when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels appear to be prophets. They wrote about all of these rebellions, and all of a sudden, they were coming true. Of course, you've all read parts of the Communist Manifesto, and you know that Marx and Engels advocated for the abolition of private property, especially that property that was held by the bourgeoisie, the equal distribution of goods, and the rule of the majority, which meant, of course, that the working class, the proletariat, was going to rule over everyone else in society. This was a philosophy that was very attractive to certain segments of the European population and, of course, would eventually spread around the world. While communism, which advocates violent revolution to establish a new political system, is a part of socialism, not all socialists are communists, and that's an important thing to remember. As a philosophy, communism would eventually overtake socialism in lots of European countries after 1848. But it's never really going to threaten the status quo of most of Europe, either because their governments are too stable, as happened in England, or because the governments see other threats, and these are threats coming from other parts of the world, as was the case in most of Europe. The one big exception, of course, is going to be Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. Workers in these various countries used the ideas of socialism and communism to begin to organize into unions, which sought to use collective bargaining to attain better working conditions for their workers. Eventually, the creation of these formal unions is going to change the political landscape in Europe because governments come to realize that if they want to effect real change for their workers, they have to work with these workers' unions. So workers' unions start to gain a larger piece of the political powers, and that's going to be an important change in the world of the Industrial Revolution. So we're left with a question. Was the Industrial Revolution the beginning of a changing world? Well, you really should figure out the answer for yourself, but think about this. Yes, there were all sorts of new innovations. Yes, these innovations had a significant impact on the standard of living for almost everyone, not just in Europe, but around the world. But did social standings really change everywhere? Were people still upset about the things that they had been upset about in the 18th century, in the 17th century, in prehistory? Maybe something to think about is how the more often and the more regularly things change, the more they seem to stay the same as well.